Georgia stared at her reflection in the operating room mirror. The surgical mask hid most of her face, leaving only her eyes attentive, focused. The last surgery hadn't been easy, but the result had been worth it. The patient would live, and that was the most important thing. Pulling off her mask and gloves, she unraveled her dark hair in a tight bundle. 15 hours on her feet were taking their toll. The thought of the evening ahead made her smile. Tonight was her and Harry's 15th wedding anniversary. Her phone vibrated, bringing up a message from her husband. "The restaurant is booked for 8. Don't be late." Georgia shook her head. Over the years, she'd learned not to take offense at his commanding tone. After all, it was Harry's determination and authority that had once attracted her. As she left the hospital, she shivered in the cool spring breeze. Spokane greeted the evening with a scattering of lights reflecting in the puddles from the recent rain. It was at least an hour's drive to the restaurant, so Georgia decided to stop by the house to change. The mansion in the upscale neighborhood greeted her with an unusual silence. Usually at this time the house was filled with the aromas of cooking. Their housekeeper, Martha, was famous for her culinary talents. But today, Harry had given her the day off, insisting on celebrating at a restaurant. As she walked up the stairs to the bedroom, Georgia lingered at the picture hanging on the wall, the picture of their wedding. Young, happy faces. She was just finishing her residency at the time, and Harry was working as a manager at a small restaurant, dreaming of owning his own business. Who would have thought that in 15 years he would have an entire chain of prestigious establishments across the state? Selecting a dark blue dress, Georgia meticulously examined herself in the mirror. At 42, she looked no worse than she had at 27. Regular yoga classes and a healthy diet had done the trick. But sometimes when she looked at the young nurses in the hospital, she wondered if that was why Harry was staying late more often. The Golden Lily restaurant was in a historic building in the center of town. The doorman, recognizing her, opened the door respectfully. Harry was already waiting at their favorite table by the window, twirling a glass of red wine in his hands. "Happy anniversary," he stood up, kissing her cheek. He smelled of expensive perfume and very little of cigarettes, even though he had quit smoking almost 10 years ago. Dinner was going on in a strange atmosphere. Harry seemed distracted, checking his phone every now and then, though he usually prided himself on turning it off on special evenings. Georgia talked about the complicated surgery, but she sensed her husband wasn't listening. "I have a present for you," he finally said, pulling out a small velvet box. Inside was an exquisite white gold necklace with a scattering of diamonds forming an intricate pattern. "It's beautiful," Georgia exhaled, admiring the play of the stones in the light of the lamps. "Try it on." Harry stood up and helped her fasten the lock. His fingers trembled slightly, something that had never happened before. Out of the corner of her eye, she noticed one of the waitresses, a young blonde, cast a strange look in their direction. It was something like anger or jealousy. The rest of the evening passed like a blur. Harry talked a lot about his plans to expand his business, about the new restaurant he was going to open in Seattle. Georgia nodded, but she couldn't shake the feeling that everything was false. At home, taking off the necklace, she noticed the date engraved on the inside of the clasp. But not today's date. The jewelry had been purchased 3 months ago. Why had Harry waited so long? And why had he lied when he said he'd picked it out especially for the anniversary? Sleep wouldn't come. Georgia lay in the dark, listening to her husband's steady breathing. 15 years ago, she had never doubted the rightness of her choice. Now, however, an uneasy feeling crept into her soul, as if she had missed some important detail in the well-oiled mechanism of their life. The morning began with the smell of coffee and a call from Eleanor Pierce, the chief accountant for the restaurant chain. "Georgia, honey, could you come over? There's a conversation." The older woman's voice sounded worried. Eleanor had worked with Harry from the beginning, back when he'd opened his first restaurant with the money Georgia had inherited from her grandmother. Usually meticulous about financial matters, the normally pedantic woman never asked for personal meetings. The office smelled of cinnamon. Eleanor was baking scones for all the employees, but today there was an untouched cup of chilled tea on the desk. "Honey, I don't know how to say." Eleanor fumbled nervously through the papers. "Some strange expenses have come up, large sums, spent as hospitality expenses, but there's no paperwork." Georgia felt nausea rise to her throat. She knew the handwriting. It was how Harry usually documented personal expenses he didn't want to publicize. "And also," Eleanor faltered, "a new restaurant has hired a manager, Melissa Baker. The salary is triple the regular rate, and bonuses, very generous bonuses." The image of the blonde waitress at the Golden Lily came to mind, the same one who'd been looking so strangely at the necklace. "Thank you, Eleanor." Georgia stood up, feeling her fingers go numb. "I'll handle it." Stepping outside, she pulled out her cell phone, dialed the number of an old friend, Private Investigator Oliver Gray. He'd once helped her find a missing patient, and they'd kept in touch ever since. "Oliver, I need your help. It's confidential." The day dragged on endlessly. Surgeries, consultations, rounds, all in a blur. The first thing Georgia did when she got home that evening was go up to the bedroom. She opened the necklace box. It was empty. Her cell phone vibrated in her pocket, a message from Oliver. "Got some information. Meet me tomorrow." Georgia sank to the edge of the bed, staring at the setting sun outside the window. 15 years together. 15 years that fit into one empty jewelry box. A thought persisted in her head. She's a neurosurgeon after all. She knows how the human brain works, how connections are formed, and how to break them. Methodical, precise, irrevocable. The meeting with Oliver was scheduled for a small coffee shop on the outskirts of town. Georgia had deliberately chosen a place far away from Harry's restaurants. A light rain was falling, turning the streets of Spokane into a blurry canvas of gray. Oliver hadn't changed much in the years they hadn't seen each other. The same worn leather jacket, the scrutinizing gaze from under his bushy eyebrows. He always reminded her of the characters in old detective movies. "Let's start with the main one." Oliver placed a thin folder on the table. "Melissa Baker, 28 years old, in Spokane for about a year. Worked in the restaurant business in Portland before that. Left after some sort of incident, the details of which are carefully hushed up." Georgia flipped through the paperwork photos, statements, copies of statements. One of the pictures showed Melissa standing at the entrance to the Golden Lily, head tilted back in laughter. The picture had been taken a month ago. "There's something else," Oliver lowered his voice. "In the last 6 months, your husband has withdrawn almost $500,000 from the company's accounts, officially, for the development of a new project in Seattle. In fact, the money went to personal expenses, expensive gifts, travel." "Travel?" Georgia raised an eyebrow. Harry had said that all of his recent trips had been strictly business. 3 weekends in Vegas, a week at the coast. Reservations are always for 2, Oliver sipped at his cooled coffee. "And that's not all. Miss Baker recently purchased an apartment in a luxury complex. The cost is well above her official income." Georgia looked at the photos in silence. Here was Melissa getting out of Harry's car. Here the two of them at a restaurant not of the Robinson chain, a small French bistro on the other side of town. And here, this was yesterday. Oliver held out the last picture. It showed Melissa standing in the window of a boutique, a familiar necklace glittering around her neck. The front doorbell jingled and Georgia instinctively flinched. But it was just a young couple seeking shelter from the rain. "What are you going to do?" Oliver looked at her intently. "Observe for now." Georgia folded the photos neatly back into the folder. "There's a big opening for the new restaurant coming up. Corporate event, press, important guests. I think it's going to be interesting. Oliver nodded understandingly. I'll keep digging, especially about that incident in Portland. Something tells me there's a bigger dog buried there than a simple dismissal. That evening, Harry talked about the preparations for the opening as if nothing had happened. Georgia listened, stirring her tea as it cooled, and noted details she hadn't noticed before, the way he avoided direct stares, the way he nervously adjusted his cufflinks, the way he checked his phone frequently. "You're coming, aren't you?" Harry looked at her with some strange insistence. "It's an important event for the company. All our partners will be there, the press." "Of course," Georgia smiled. "I mean, I'm always there for you." The next 2 weeks flew by in a whirlwind of events. Georgia immersed herself in work, complicated surgeries, consultations, endless conciliums. Harry disappeared to the new restaurant, arriving late, talking only about the upcoming opening. Vincent Clark, the head chef of the main restaurant, called out of the blue, "Georgia, sorry to bother you, it's just, there are things you should know." They met in the park. Vincent was nervous, rubbing the sleeve of his fancy jacket. "I've been working with Harry for 10 years. He gave me a chance when others turned their backs. I appreciate that. But what's happening now?" He shook his head. "Melissa showed up 6 months ago, started hanging around Harry right away, and then everyone at the restaurant knows, but they don't say anything, afraid of losing their jobs." "What exactly does everyone know, Vincent?" "They don't even hide much. Late-night private meetings, trips to tastings together, and recently," he faltered, "I overheard them talking recently. They were discussing some kind of plan, something to do with company stock." Georgia tensed. Harry held a controlling interest in the restaurant chain, but she owned a quarter of it, the same stake that had once been the backbone of their family business. The opening day of the new restaurant was unusually sunny. North Star is located in a restored mansion at the beginning of the century. Exquisite interior, panoramic windows, open kitchen. Harry did not skimp on creating an atmosphere of luxury. Georgia chose for the event a simple black dress and pearl earrings, a gift from her mother. No flashy jewelry. Their absence should have spoken louder than any words. Harry greeted the guests at the entrance. Next to him, draped in a red dress, Melissa's smile brightened. Around her neck glittered the very same necklace. "Darling!" Harry tried to kiss Georgia on the cheek, but she deftly dodged, pretending to fix her hair. "Meet Melissa Baker, our new executive director of development." "We've met before." Georgia extended her hand for a handshake. "At the Golden Lily, haven't we?" Melissa looked confused for a moment, but quickly pulled herself together. "Yes, that's right. It's a beautiful necklace, isn't it? Harry has impeccable taste." There was an awkward pause. Somewhere in the back of the room, glasses clinked as the formal part of the event began. Georgia took a seat at a table in the front row. Harry went up on the small stage for a welcoming speech. He spoke of the company's growth, new horizons, and a team of professionals. Melissa stood a little apart, but every time Harry mentioned future projects, her smile grew wider. Familiar faces flashed through the room, suppliers, partners, journalists. Many of them had been at her and Harry's wedding. Some remembered how the business had started. Georgia caught their glances, sympathetic, curious, judgmental. Eleanor Pierce crouched beside her. "You're doing well, dear. But you know, there's something else. The documents I was talking about. They've been retroactively altered." "Who?" "Guess. Our new management star. Only she doesn't know I still have copies. All the copies." After the formal speeches, the buffet began. Georgia watched Melissa flit between the guests, charming everyone with her smile. Harry followed her with his gaze, forgetting to answer any of her questions. Toward the end of the evening, the first guests began to leave. Georgia noticed Melissa furtively showing Harry something on her phone screen. They exchanged quick glances and smiled synchronized. Back home, Georgia stood under the hot shower for a long time, washing away the falseness of the evening. The scraps of conversations, glances, and smiles swirled in her head. The puzzle was slowly coming together. The phone jingled with a message from Oliver. Found some information on Portland. You need to see it. Urgent. Georgia wiped the fogged mirror and looked at her reflection. There was that special glint in her eyes that comes before a complex operation. When you know it's going to be a virtuoso job that requires absolute precision. Harry didn't come home that night. She didn't expect him to. On the bedside table was a photograph of their wedding day. Young, happy, hopeful. Georgia carefully placed the picture face down. In the morning, she called her lawyer. I need a consultation. And yes, it's confidential. The plan was beginning to take shape. She is, after all, a neurosurgeon. She knows sometimes you have to act decisively to save a patient, and not be afraid of blood. Oliver's office smelled like the leather of old files and freshly brewed coffee. The detective spread documents on the desk, yellowed newspaper clippings, photographs, police reports. The Portland of 5 years ago was revealing itself to Georgia in every unseemly detail. She used a different name back then, Melissa White. Oliver tapped his finger on an old photograph. Worked at the Seaside Breeze restaurant. Married the owner, Robert White. Wealthy man, widower, 30 years older. Georgia scrutinized the photo. Melissa in her wedding dress, a gray-haired man beside her. Happy smiles, champagne, confetti. A year later, Robert White died of a heart attack. Oliver pulled out the police report. The autopsy showed traces of a rare drug. An investigation was launched, but no evidence was found. Melissa inherited the restaurant, sold it through a front man, and disappeared. Then, 6 months later, she showed up here in Spokane as Melissa Baker. Georgia leaned back in her chair, covering her eyes. Memory obligingly threw up pictures of the past, her and Harry's first meeting 15 years ago. She'd been finishing her residency then, working part-time at a small cafe. Harry had walked in on a chilly fall evening, drenched, freezing, with a stack of papers under his armpit. He ordered a coffee and sat there until closing time, working on a business plan for his future restaurant. You know, your eyes light up when you talk about your dreams, she said then, sitting down beside him with a cup of fresh coffee. He looked up from his papers, smiled. And yours is when you talk about medicine. They talked until dawn. Harry shared his plans to open a fine dining restaurant. She talked about complicated surgeries and her desire to specialize in neurosurgery. Two dreamers, he grinned under his breath. Only I don't have the startup capital, and you don't have the money for additional training. A week later, her grandmother died, leaving an impressive inheritance. The choice was made without hesitation. They married and put all the money into Harry's first restaurant. Georgia? Oliver's voice brought her back to reality. There's something else. Back in Portland, Melissa was close to a financier. He was helping her with the sale of the restaurant. And what happened to him? Missing in action. Last seen heading to meet her. Georgia picked up a recent photo. Melissa walking out of the bank in a business suit. Still the same blonde hair, confident gait, predatory smile. Her phone vibrated. A message from Harry. I'll be late at the restaurant. Important meeting with suppliers. Suppliers means, Georgia showed the message to Oliver, check the visitor log for the business center on Riverside Avenue. Melissa's apartment is there. Oliver nodded, making a note in his notebook. Already working on it. By the way, she started to probe for shares in the company, talking to lawyers who specialize in corporate law. Georgia remembered 15 years ago when she and Harry had drawn up the paperwork for their first restaurant. Her insistence on keeping a stake in the business had hurt him then. You don't trust me? He asked. I do. But my grandmother taught me you need clarity in business. She was a wise woman, her grandmother. It was just a pity she hadn't lived to see how right she'd been. Leaving Oliver's, Georgia drove not home, but to the old section of town. Here, a remodeled Victorian mansion housed their first restaurant, the Moonlight Sonata. Parking across the street, she watched the evening lights come on as the first customers pulled up. Once upon a time, she and Harry had greeted each guest themselves. He in an impeccable suit, she in a simple black dress. Dreaming, planning, supporting each other. I wonder what it would be like to be Melissa, to see a goal and go for it without sacrifice? Georgia grinned. She could be a predator too. She'd just chosen a different battlefield, the operating room, where she fought death every day, and almost always wins. In the hospital, she was waiting for an urgent operation, an aneurysm of a brain vessel, a young patient, mother of 2 children. While the orderlies prepared the OR, Georgia studied the scans. Thin vessel wall, ready to burst at any moment. One wrong step, an irreparable disaster. "Dr. Robinson, we're ready," the nurse called out. 4 hours of jewelry work. Every movement calibrated, every step calculated. No margin for error. The operation was a success. Tired but satisfied, Georgia left the hospital at midnight. There was a surprise waiting for her in the parking lot. Eleanor Pierce. "Sorry for the late visit," the older woman nervously rubbed the strap of her purse. "But it's important. I've checked all the paperwork. They're preparing something big. Transfer of assets, change in management structure." "When is it scheduled for?" "The board meeting is in 2 weeks. They're sure you won't see a catch in the paperwork. Harry knows. You've never gotten into the legal intricacies." Georgia shook her head. "He's forgotten that I have a knack for learning. 15 years practicing neurosurgery teaches you to notice details." "There's something else." Eleanor lowered her voice. "Melissa's been meeting with people from the IRS. I'm afraid they're digging up the whole company." "The whole company or just Harry?" Eleanor raised her eyebrows in surprise. "Is there a difference?" "Probably," Georgia smiled. "You know, in surgery, there's such a thing as controlled bleeding. Sometimes you have to let the wound bleed a little so you can see the surgical field better." She was greeted at home by silence and a note from Harry. "Flew to Seattle. Be back in 3 days. Important negotiations." There was an open bottle of wine and 2 glasses on the kitchen table. One had a brightly colored lipstick imprint. Georgia went upstairs to the bedroom, pulled an old jewelry box from the closet. At the bottom, beneath the papers and photographs, was an envelope with a letter from her grandmother. "Dear granddaughter, if you're reading this letter, it means I'm gone. I'm not just leaving you money, I'm leaving you the freedom of choice. Use it wisely. And remember, sometimes you have to lose something precious to gain something priceless." Georgia ran her fingers over the faded lines. A plan was forming in her head, clear, deliberate, ruthless, like a complex operation where every step had to be calibrated to the millimeter. The phone buzzed with a message from Oliver. "Got a hit on Melissa's bank accounts in Portland. You won't believe what I found." Outside the window, dawn was breaking. Somewhere in Seattle, Harry and Melissa were probably plotting their cloudless future, unaware that their own game was about to turn against them. Georgia walked over to the window. The city seemed especially beautiful in the morning light. 15 years ago, she and Harry had looked out at this same landscape and dreamed of the future. Well, the future had arrived. It just wasn't what she'd imagined. She pulled out her phone and dialed. "Oliver, we need to meet. It's time to develop the photos." The photos Oliver had brought told the story of betrayal without a single word. Georgia spread them out on the desk in her home office, a chronology of the past 6 months in black and white and color snapshots. Portland had been reluctant to reveal its secrets. There were many inconsistencies in the case of Robert White's death. Oliver got copies of medical reports, 3 different experts, 3 conflicting opinions on the cause of death. Traces of a rare drug were found in the blood. Oliver tapped his finger on one of the reports. Interestingly, this substance is used primarily in cardiac surgery. It's almost impossible to get it without a prescription. Georgia frowned. There was a private clinic in Portland that specialized in cardiology. See if anyone Melissa knows worked there. There was a quiet knock on the office door. Martha, their housekeeper, appeared on the doorstep. "Sorry to bother you, Mrs. Robinson. The papers from the bank have arrived. Also," she hesitated, "Miss Baker came by this morning, looking for Mr. Robinson. She was acting strange, asked about your schedule." Georgia looked over to Oliver. "Thank you, Martha. You did the right thing to tell me." When the housekeeper left, Oliver pulled out a new folder. "Here's what I was able to find on the financial transactions." Melissa opened 3 new accounts at different banks, significant sums in each. The origin of the money is, let's just say, it's questionable. "And what's this?" Georgia pointed to a strange document with a bank logo on it. "And this is the most interesting. It looks like Miss Baker is trying to get power of attorney to manage some of the company's assets. Already the paperwork has been prepared to transfer several restaurants to a new management company." Georgia leaned back in her chair, covering her eyes. A conversation from 15 years ago came to mind. She and Harry discussing the management structure of the first restaurant. "It has to be done legally," she'd insisted then. "No loopholes, no gray schemes." Harry brushed it off. "You're thinking too much about the wrong things. We're family. What possible doubt could there be?" The phone vibrated. A message from Eleanor. "Come to the office right away. Found something important." The accounting office smelled of fresh baked goods, Eleanor's old habit of baking cinnamon buns for the staff. But today, only file folders cluttered the desk. "Look," Eleanor spread out the papers. "For the last 3 months there's been some strange payments going through accounting. Technically, it's consulting services, but the amounts are growing exponentially." "Who are the payments going to?" "To a company called Morningstar Consulting, registered 2 months ago. Guess who the owner is?" Georgia picked up the document. "Melissa Baker." "Not exactly." Eleanor pulled out another sheet. "Technically, the company is owned by one James Baker, supposedly a brother, but all payments go through accounts Melissa has access to." There was a knock at the door. The courier brought a new stack of documents. Among them was a folder marked Top Confidential. "It's a draft reorganization of the company." Eleanor put on her glasses. "They plan to move the main assets into a new structure, and the old company will be left with debt and troubled assets." "And when are they going to do that?" "At the next board meeting, in 10 days. Georgia pulled out her cell phone, dialed her attorney's number. "We need to meet, today." Simon Blackwood's law office was located in an old building in the downtown business district. Solid mahogany doors, leather chairs, dimmed lights, an air of respectability and privacy. So arrayed, Simon studied the documents. The scheme is classic: asset stripping, share dilution, artificial bankruptcy. But there are nuances. Like what? First, your share in the company is protected by a prenuptial agreement. Second, there are the documents of the first restaurant where the source of the startup capital is clearly stated. Third, he pulled out an old folder. "Remember 15 years ago when we formalized the supplemental agreement about veto power over key decisions?" Georgia nodded. Harry had signed the document without reading it then. He'd been too engrossed in preparing for the restaurant opening. "That's your trump card," Simon tapped his finger on the folder. "But you have to proceed with caution. One wrong move and they'll be able to transfer assets before we can stop the process." Back at home, Georgia found Harry in the study. He was sorting through some papers, hastily hiding them when she appeared. "Sorry I didn't give you a heads up. I got back early." He tried to kiss her cheek. "How was your day?" "Productive," Georgia smiled. "Getting ready for an important surgery. You know, neurosurgery is all about precision. One wrong cut and the consequences are irreversible. Harry nervously adjusted his tie. Yeah, sure. By the way, there's an important board meeting in 10 days. You'll be there, won't you? Of course. I always support your endeavors. At night, lying in bed, Georgia listened to her husband's steady breathing. 15 years ago, she'd fallen in love with his energy, his dreams, his ability to see things in perspective. Who would have thought those same qualities would one day turn against her? The phone vibrated quietly. A message from Oliver. Found a connection to a clinic in Portland. Get the paperwork ready. It's going to be hot. The next day, Georgia met with Vincent Clark at a small cafe on the outskirts of town. They're planning to change the entire management of the restaurants. The chef stirred the sugar in his coffee nervously. Melissa has already picked new people, loyal to her personally. And the old employees. Mass layoffs under the pretext of reorganization. Already have orders ready. Georgia took a sip of her cooled coffee. Why do you think she chose our company? Don't you get it? Vincent grinned bitterly. I mean, it's the perfect target. A successful business built on family relationships, where all decisions were made on trust, where no one waited for a stab in the back. That evening, a call came in from Portland, a former investigator who had worked on the Robert White case. I always knew there was something wrong with this case. The hoarse voice in the receiver sounded tired. But the evidence was lacking. And now the statute of limitations is almost up. Almost doesn't mean completely, Georgia observed. Exactly. And you know what's interesting? There was evidence in the case file that pointed to a connection to the medical facility, but someone removed them from the investigation file. Who? A man from the DA's office, who, shortly afterwards, suddenly got rich and quit. Georgia jotted down a name, another thread in a complex tangle of lies and betrayal. The next day she met Eleanor in the park. The old accountant brought new documents. They're covering their tracks, the older woman said quietly, looking around. Rewriting contracts retroactively, cleaning up databases. But I still have copies. All the copies. Keep them safe. Georgia squeezed Eleanor's hand. We'll need them soon. Back at the hospital, she plunged into her work. Complex surgery followed complex surgery. Patients, paperwork, conciliums, the usual rhythm of a neurosurgeon's life. But now, in every movement of the scalpel, she saw a future plan of action. Precise incision, careful removal of diseased tissue, restoration of healthy structure. Oliver called in the evening, got an update on the clinic, found the nurse who worked there at the time. She's ready to talk. Where do we meet? Tomorrow, noon. And Georgia, be careful. Your house is being watched. At night, she stood at the window for a long time, looking out at the lights of the city. Somewhere out there, in the darkness, lurk people who think they can destroy with impunity what has been 15 years in the making. They don't know they've miscalculated, that it's not just a cheating wife playing against them, but a neurosurgeon who is used to making decisions that affect people's lives on a daily basis. Georgia smiled at her reflection in the dark glass. There's a board meeting in 10 days. Harry and Melissa are confident of their victory. Well, let them think so for now. After all, the best surgeries are the ones you prepare for most carefully. The nurse at the Portland clinic was a petite woman with tired eyes and nervous movements. Sarah Jenkins had worked in the cardiology department for 15 years and remembered every unusual patient. Mr. White was laid up with us just before he died. She pored over the rosary, avoiding looking Georgia in the eye. A routine examination, nothing serious. But his wife, she was always asking about medications, wondering about the effects of various drugs. She introduced herself as Melissa White? Oliver placed a photograph on the table. Yes, that's her. Frequently socialized with Dr. Hendricks. They had long conversations in his office, and then... Sarah fell silent. Then what happened? Several vials of a rare drug went missing. An internal investigation was launched. Dr. Hendricks abruptly quit, and a week later, Mr. White died. Georgia looked over at Oliver. What happened to Dr. Hendricks? Went somewhere back east. Said he got a lucrative offer. But before he left, he tried to talk to me. He seemed scared. After the meeting, Oliver took Georgia to a small cafe. It was pouring rain, turning the streets into a blurry canvas of gray colors. I have a contact in Portland. The detective stirred the cooled coffee. Let's see if we can find Hendricks. If he's alive, his testimony could make a big difference. There's not much time. Georgia glanced at the calendar on her phone. We're 7 days away from the board meeting. We have a trump card. Oliver pulled out a thumb drive. Here are documents on all of Melissa's financial transactions over the last 5 years, including the ones she'd rather forget about. That evening, Georgia met Vincent Clark at his restaurant after hours. The chef looked worried. They've started changing suppliers. He poured wine into glasses. Old contracts are being torn up, new ones are being signed, with companies no one knows anything about. Let me guess. All the new suppliers are connected to Morningstar Consulting. Exactly. And their prices are, let's just say they're weird. At times unreasonably high, at times suspiciously low. Georgia took a sip of wine. Classic money withdrawal scheme. Do you think many of the old employees will stay after the reorganization? Those who are aware of the reality of the situation are unlikely. Vincent chuckled bitterly. I've already been hinted that my position will be cut. 15 years of work. And just like that. The next day, Georgia met with the lawyer. Simon Blackwood prepared a packet of documents. We can block the deals through the courts, he laid out the papers. But we need hard evidence of fraud, and most importantly, we need to act quickly. How fast can they get the assets out? With the documents prepared in a matter of hours, it all depends on how well prepared they are. Georgia tapped her fingers on the table thoughtfully. And if we strike first? What do you mean? Suppose we have evidence not only of company fraud but also of other crimes. Simon looked at her carefully. Are you talking about the White case? Not only that, Oliver found some interesting connections between Melissa and several cases of corporate fraud in different states. Different names, but the MO is the same. Eleanor called this evening. Georgia, they've started shredding documents. I managed to make copies, but I'm afraid they suspect something. Where are the copies now? In a safe place. But I'm being watched. I saw a car outside my house today. Don't go anywhere. I'll send Oliver. At night, Georgia couldn't sleep. Harry was on the phone in the next room. A muffled voice, short phrases, nervous laughter. She went to the window. A silhouette flashed in the shadows of the trees opposite the house. The watcher wasn't even trying to hide much. In the morning, a message came from Oliver. Found Hendricks. Lives under a different name in a small town in Montana. Ready to talk, but afraid. Fear is a good counselor, Georgia replied, especially when you have something to lose. At the hospital, a complicated surgery awaited her. A young patient, a brain tumor in a hard-to-reach spot, 4 hours of jewelry work, every movement calibrated to the millimeter. You understand the risks, don't you? She asked the patient before the operation. I do, but sometimes you have to risk everything to save the most important thing. Those words rolled around in her head as she operated. Risk, all or nothing. One wrong move and disaster was inevitable. After the surgery, she was in for a surprise. Melissa herself. Dr. Robinson, the professional predator, smiled. Can I talk to you for a minute? They made their way to the doctor's lounge. Melissa exuded the confidence of someone used to getting everything she wanted. I heard you were curious about my past. She perched on the edge of the desk. You know, curiosity isn't always a useful quality. Really? Georgia calmly removed her surgical gown. And I thought it was curiosity that drove science forward. Sometimes it's better not to know some things, for your own peace of mind. Peace of mind is overrated, especially those who are used to living other people's lives. Melissa tensed. Is that a threat? Not at all. Just an observation. You know, in my profession, it's important to notice details. The slightest change can speak of serious problems. That evening, Georgia met with Simon in his office. The lawyer prepared new documents. We can hit from both sides. He laid out the papers. Corporate fraud and felonies, but we have to pick our moment. At a board meeting? Risky. They've probably prepared a backup plan. Exactly, Georgia smiled. Let them think they're in control. That's their biggest weakness. At night, she sat in her office looking through old photographs. Their first restaurant, the opening of the second, the celebrations, the successes, the dreams. 15 years of life that Harry was about to cross out with the stroke of a pen. The phone vibrated. A message from an unknown number. I know what happened to Robert White, and I can prove it. Georgia glanced at her watch. The board meeting was 5 days away. Time to get her rocks together. In the morning, she called Oliver. Find the sender of the message. Also, check all of Melissa's accounts from last month, especially the overseas transfers. Do you think she's preparing an escape route? I would if I were her. It's not like she knows what we dug up in Portland. The day passed in the usual cares, surgeries, consultations, rounds. But now every minute was scheduled, every action calculated, like a complex surgical procedure where there is no margin for error. Eleonora called in the evening. They've scheduled an extraordinary audit of the accounting department. It seems they suspect something. Let them do it. Just make sure you keep copies of all the documents. I already did. And you know what? I found an interesting detail in the new contracts. All the vendor companies are registered to the same person. Guess who? James Baker? Exactly. Only problem is there's no such person by that name, at least not in the official records. Georgia smiled. Great. Pass that information on to Simon, and be careful, you're still being watched. At night, she stood under the shower for a long time, washing away the fatigue of the previous day. Her mind was spinning with scraps of conversations, documents, photos. The puzzle was slowly forming into a clear picture. Harry came back at midnight. He smelled of expensive wine and Melissa's perfume. Sorry, important investor meeting. He tried to kiss her cheek. Of course, darling, Georgia smiled. By the way, don't forget, there's a board meeting in 5 days. I remember. You'll be there, won't you? Of course. I'm always supportive of your endeavors. In the morning came a message from Oliver. Hendricks has agreed to talk, but there's a condition, full protection, and new documents. Will do. Just make sure he's in time for the meeting. Simon's office smelled of leather and expensive tobacco. The lawyer laid out the new documents. All ready to go. He tapped a finger on a folder. As soon as they start acting up, we'll strike. The key is to pick the right moment. Georgia looked out the window. The city was living its life, unaware of the drama unfolding in one of its successful companies. You know, Simon, in surgery, there is such a thing as a point of no return, the point at which processes become irreversible. And we're almost at that point? No, she smiled. We'll let them reach it on their own. And then there will be surgery to remove the tumor. Complicated, risky, but necessary. In a small Montana town, the first snow has fallen. Dr. Hendricks, now known as Michael Grant, lived in a small house on the outskirts. The tattered pickup truck in the driveway, the peeling paint on the fence, the unkept garden. Everything spoke of a man used to hiding from the past. I knew this would happen one day. He poured himself a whiskey with trembling hands. That the past would come back. Oliver pulled out a tape recorder. Tell me about Melissa White. She showed up at the clinic with her husband, just a routine checkup, but then the questions started about drugs, about dosages, about how to detect traces of certain substances at autopsy. You helped her get the drug? Hendricks took a gulp of whiskey. She knew about my debts, about the problems with my license, offered to solve all the problems in exchange for a small favor. And you accepted. Jesus, I didn't know. I thought she was just trying to scare my husband into changing his will. And then Robert died, and I realized she'd planned the whole thing, every move. Georgia listened to the tape in Simon's office. Rain drizzled outside the window, blurring the lights of the evening city. Is that enough for the prosecution? She looked at the lawyer. Together with the financial records and the nurse's testimony, more than enough. But we need to proceed with caution. One false move and they'll have time to cover their tracks. The phone buzzed a message from Eleanor. Here we go. They've started the process of reissuing the assets. Earlier than we expected, Simon frowned. We're still 3 days away from the board meeting. So something's been suspected. Georgia pulled out her phone. Oliver, Plan B. Starting right now. Events were unfolding rapidly. The first blow came from the IRS, an unscheduled inspection of all the chain's restaurants. Inspectors showed up at all the establishments at the same time, paralyzing operations for several hours. Harry rushed between restaurants, trying to keep the situation under control. Melissa had disappeared. Her phone wasn't answering. She hadn't shown up at the office. What's going on? Harry burst into the house late at night. Where did this check come from? I have no idea, Georgia stirred her tea quietly. I've been in the hospital all day today, complicated surgery. Suspicion flashed in his eyes. Is there anything you want to tell me? Do you? She looked up from her cup. Maybe you'd like to tell me about Morningstar Consulting, or about new suppliers, or about Portland. Harry turned pale. What do you know about Portland? Enough. You know, in medicine, there's such a thing as metastasis, when a disease spreads throughout the body, unnoticeable but inexorable. The next day, a new scandal broke. The press leaked information about supplier fraud. The company's stock plummeted 30% in the first hour of trading. Vincent called in a panic. They're laying people off in droves, no warning, no compensation. Melissa showed up at the main office collecting documents, giving some kind of orders. Let her collect, Georgia smiled. Every document she touches leaves a mark. A note from Martha was waiting for her at the hospital. Security people came by, looking for some documents in your office. Did they take anything? No, but they copied your computer hard drive. Georgia laughed. Let them copy it. Everything important is in a safe place a long time ago. Oliver called in the evening. Melissa's trying to move money out through offshore. 3 transfers in the last 24 hours. What about Hendricks? He's in a safe house, ready to testify at a moment's notice. At dinner, Harry tried to pretend everything was all right. Talked about the company's growth plans, new projects. Georgia listened, noting how his hands trembled, how he avoided a direct look. You know, she set her fork aside. I've always marveled at how easily some people betray those who believed in them. What are you talking about? About the necklace, the very one you gave me for my anniversary, and then you gave it to your mistress. Harry jumped up from the table. You followed me. Why? Melissa made sure everyone found out herself. She does like to brag about trophies, doesn't she? During the night, a thunderstorm broke. Georgia stood at the window, watching the lightning ripping through the sky. In the next room, Harry was having a tense conversation on the phone. What do you mean the accounts are blocked? How could they? No, wait, don't do anything. I'll figure it out myself. In the morning came a text from Simon. The IRS has found irregularities at 7 restaurants. A formal investigation is underway. Great, Georgia replied. Now for phase 2. Panic reigned in the company's office. Employees were packing up, shredding documents, whispering in corners. Eleanor watched with a sad smile. They think they can hide the loose ends, she shook her head. They don't realize that every action leaves a mark. Melissa showed up closer to evening, pale, with circles under her eyes, locked herself in Harry's office, refusing to admit anyone. She's trying to salvage what she can, Vincent reported, but it looks like the rats are starting to flee the ship. Georgia spent the day in the operating room. The complex spinal cord surgery required total concentration. 4 hours of jewelry work where every move could be crucial. "How do you do it?" a young assistant asked. "Stay so calm in the most intense moments." "The secret is simple. You have to see the end goal. And remember, sometimes you have to hurt to heal." Eleanor called in the evening. They found the documents, the ones about the forged signatures. Melissa's furious. Let her be mad. The important thing is she's starting to make mistakes. The news was the first story about possible fraud in the company. Journalists were linking the current scandal to the Portland story. Someone had already started digging into Melissa's past. Harry came home past midnight, gaunt, aged in a single day. "Is that you?" he asked from the doorstep. "Did you start this investigation?" "No, dear," Georgia shook her head. "It was you who started it. The moment you decided you could betray the man who gave you everything." The next day, a new scandal broke. Documents leaked online about the company's ties to suspicious offshore entities. The stock plummeted another 20%. "They're trying to salvage what they can," Oliver reported. "But it looks like the ship is already sinking." Georgia smiled. "You know what the best part of surgery is? The moment when you remove a tumor. The process is irreversible. It's either success or—" The phone rang, an unfamiliar number. "Bitch!" Melissa's voice shook with rage. "You think you can compete with me?" "No, honey," Georgia said calmly. "I'm just doing my job, removing a malignant growth from a healthy body." "You're going to regret this." "Not anymore. You know what the funny thing is? You started this whole thing yourself, the moment you put on my necklace." The board meeting was 1 day away. Simon had prepared all the paperwork. Oliver had gathered the latest evidence. Eleanor had kept copies of all the financial transactions. "Tomorrow is the deciding day," the lawyer said. "Are you ready?" Georgia looked at the picture of their first restaurant. You know what Harry and Melissa's biggest mistake was? They thought they were just dealing with a cheating wife, not a neurosurgeon who makes life and death decisions every day. At night, she stood under the shower for a long time, washing away the tension of the past day. Tomorrow, everything would be decided. All the cards would be laid out on the table. "Georgia." Harry's voice from behind the door sounded uncertain. "We need to talk." "Of course, darling." She wrapped herself in a towel. "Tomorrow, at the board meeting, there'll be plenty to talk about." The morning before the board meeting was unusually cold for this time of year. Georgia woke up before dawn. The surgeon's habit of starting the day early had been ingrained in the back of her mind over years of practice. Harry wasn't home. His half of the bed was left untouched. "He didn't come overnight," Martha reported, serving coffee. "But Miss Baker called 3 times, asked me to deliver some papers." "And what did you say?" "That I had no right to take the documents without your permission." The doorbell rang as a courier brought a bulky package from Simon. Inside was the latest investigative material, including witness statements from Portland. "Good morning." Oliver's voice sounded tired on the phone. "There's an update. Hendricks recorded a formal statement, but—" "What happened?" "Someone broke into his house last night. They were looking for documents. Luckily, we were able to move him to safety in time." Georgia shook her head. "They're getting nervous. Then we're on the right track." A surprise visit awaited her at the hospital. Vincent Clark showed up at the emergency room with a split eyebrow and abrasions on his face. 2 unknowns. He wrinkled his nose as the nurse treated the wounds, waited outside the restaurant, said it was a friendly warning. From who? Didn't identify themselves, but one of them is a former bouncer at a club Melissa's husband owned in Portland. Georgia pulled out her cell phone. Oliver? Check out Melissa's criminal connections in Portland, especially in the period after Robert White's death. Eleanor intercepted her in the hallway, pale with shaking hands. They hacked into my computer. She held out a smartphone with photos. The whole database, but they don't know about the backups. Where are they? In a safe place. A safety deposit box in a different name. They'll never guess. It was 4 hours before the meeting started. Georgia spent 2 of them in the operating room, a scheduled surgery that couldn't be canceled. The work helped her focus, cut away everything unnecessary. Scalpel, her voice sounded calm and confident. Clamp, suction. The young assistant couldn't take it anymore. How can you operate on a day like this? It's days like this that you have to operate. When someone's life depends on your actions, your own problems take a back seat. After the operation came a message from Simon. They're trying to call an extraordinary shareholders meeting urgently, before the official one. It won't work, Georgia replied. The bylaws require 3 days' notice. They're hoping for minority support. Who already know about the financial shenanigans? I doubt it. She was met in the hospital corridor by an unexpected visitor, a young woman in whom Georgia didn't immediately recognize Harry's former secretary. I'm sorry to bother you, she rubbed the strap of her purse nervously, but I have to tell you, I saw Miss Baker destroying documents, and not just that. What exactly? Conversations, strange phone calls. She was contacting some people in Portland, talking about cleaning up the trail and final judgment. Georgia forwarded this information to Oliver. The detective responded almost instantly. Already working on it. Got some interesting connections with a private security firm. The meeting was 2 hours away when Vincent called. They're moving documents out of the main office, boxes of them. Let them move them out. The main stuff's long since copied. In the hospital lobby, she was surprised to see Harry himself, slumped, unshaven, eyes red from lack of sleep. We need to talk. His voice sounded hoarse. At the meeting, dear. There'll be plenty to talk about. Georgia, listen. He grabbed her arm. You don't understand. It's not what you think. What do I think, Harry? She released his hand calmly. That you betrayed the man who gave you everything? That you got involved with an adventuress who already went unpunished once after her husband's death? He turned pale. Where did you? It doesn't matter. The other thing that matters is that every action has consequences. I thought you understood that. An hour before the meeting came a text from Oliver. Found a connection. Security firm in Portland. 3 unsolved murders. And you know what's interesting? Melissa received large sums of money into offshore accounts after each one. Georgia smiled. Send the information to Simon. Have him prepare the paperwork. There was an atmosphere of subdued anticipation in the company office. Employees were whispering in corners, avoiding looking each other in the eye. Melissa took a seat at the head of the table, her flawless makeup unable to hide the traces of a sleepless night. All the paperwork ready? Her voice sounded strained. Yes, Miss Baker. The young lawyer unfolded the folders. But there's a problem with the shares. We'll solve it in the process. She tapped her fingers nervously on the table. The important thing is to start the procedure. Georgia took her seat across the table. Simon sat next to her, spreading out his paperwork. Ready? The lawyer whispered. More than ready. You know, there's a point in surgery when you start the main stage of the operation. All the preparations are finished, instruments at the ready. Harry was the last to show up. Wrinkled suit, shaky hands, running eyes. Melissa gave a barely perceptible wince at his appearance. Let's get started. She tapped her pen on the table. We have a busy agenda. Full indeed, Georgia smiled. Especially the issue of financial fraud and asset stripping. A whisper swept through the room. Melissa turned pale. What are you talking about? About Morningstar Consulting, about the fake vendors, about forged documents, Georgia began, laying out folders on the table. And of course, about the events in Portland. Harry jumped up. That's slander. We're going to sue. Already have. Simon held up his hand. The suit is filed this morning, along with a statement to the DA's office. Melissa rose slowly. You're bluffing. You have no proof. Really? Georgia pulled out a flash drive. Is Dr. Hendrick's testimony of interest to you, or bank statements from offshore accounts? Or maybe, she paused, material about ties to a certain security firm in Portland? Silence hung. The city noise outside the window, the hum of the air conditioner, Harry's heavy breathing could be heard. You don't understand. Melissa tried to keep her composure. This is big business. There's no room for sentimentality. Right, Georgia nodded. So let's talk business. About how you plan to move assets out. About how you forged documents. About how, she paused, how you got rid of anyone who got in the way of your plans. There was a knock at the door. 2 men in strict suits appeared on the threshold. Investigators from the financial police, Simon introduced them. They have a few questions. Melissa rushed for the exit, but it was too late. The uniformed men were already waiting in the hallway. This isn't over, she hissed, glaring at Georgia. It is, the latter shook her head. You know what your mistake was? You thought you were dealing with a regular housewife, not a man who holds other people's lives in his hands every day. Harry sat up, wrapping his arms around his head. Why? Why did you do this? Me? Georgia looked at him in surprise. You're the one who started it all, darling. The moment you decided you could betray the man who gave you everything. By the way, she pulled a velvet box out of her purse. Here's your necklace. Melissa left it in my office. Apparently, she thought it brought bad luck. Outside the window, rain began to fall. The city was washing away the dirt of the day. Georgia watched as the police took Melissa away, as the financial police seized documents, as Harry tried to explain something to the investigators. What now? Simon asked. Now? She smiled. Now we have to rebuild what they tried to destroy. You know, in surgery, after the tumor is removed, the most important thing begins. Rehabilitation. The phone jingled. A message from Oliver. They found the body of a missing financier from Portland. Guess who was the last person to see him alive? Send the information to the investigators, Georgia replied. Let the picture be complete. She returned to the hospital that evening. Waiting for an emergency surgery was a young patient with a head injury. Are you sure you can operate? The head of the department asked. After a day like this? More than. She put on her surgical gown. You know, sometimes you have to hurt to heal. The key is not to misdiagnose. Outside the operating room window, the rain continued to fall. The city was cleansing itself of mud, washing away the traces of betrayal and lies. A new chapter was beginning. News of the scandal in the Robinson restaurant empire filled all the local papers. Journalists besieged the company's office, trying to get comments from the employees. Eleanor methodically collected clippings. Each article added new details to the overall picture of the collapse. Financial fraud at a restaurant chain, dark past of a successful businesswoman, Portland murder, new details. The headline screamed from the newspaper pages, telling a story of betrayal and retribution. Georgia watched with the detached calm of someone who had completed a complex operation. Now, all that was left to do was to follow the healing process. Melissa has been transferred to the detention center, Oliver reported as he pulled into the hospital. Refuses to testify, wants a lawyer from Portland. The same one who helped shut down the White case? Exactly. Only problem is, he suddenly disappeared. Disappeared like he never existed. They were intercepted in the hallway by a young investigator, Michael Donovan, who was working on a financial fraud case. "Dr. Robinson, we have some new information." He opened a folder. "The bodies of 2 more people have been discovered in Portland. Both were connected to the investigation into Robert White's death." "And how long ago were they found?" 3 years ago. But the cases were dismissed as accidents. We're reviewing them now." Georgia shook her head. How many lives she ruined in pursuit of her goal. There was a patient waiting for her in the room, the same young man with a head injury she had operated on the day of the expose. The guy was on the mend, showing a remarkable will to live. "You know," he said as she checked his stitches, "sometimes you have to lose everything to realize what's really important." Those words echoed in her soul. 15 years of marriage turned to rubble by greed and betrayal. Simon called that evening. "Harry's trying to negotiate with the investigation. Offers to turn Melissa in exchange for a reduced sentence." "How predictable," Georgia grinned. "He's always had a knack for finding an advantage in any situation." "There's something else. They found some strange transfers in the files, large sums to accounts in Switzerland, and the recipient, you wouldn't believe it." "Dr. Hendricks?" "No, a former investigator from Portland, the same one who closed the White case." Martha intercepted her in the hospital hallway, agitated with shaking hands. "Someone was in the house," she whispered, "while I was out shopping. There are search marks everywhere, but nothing's missing." "Take it easy." Georgia pulled out her cell phone. "Oliver, need your help." The detective arrived 20 minutes later, inspected the house, checked the security cameras. "Professional job," he showed the footage. 2 of them, acted fast, knew what they were looking for. "And what were they hoping to find?" "Documents, I guess. Something that could compromise the evidence against Melissa." There was a new story in the news as reporters dug up the history of Melissa's first marriage. Before Robert White, there was another husband, a successful Seattle businessman who died under strange circumstances. "How did we miss that?" Oliver frowned, looking through the paperwork. "She used a different last name, different paperwork. How many more lives on her conscience?" Georgia shook her head. "And how many times has she gotten away with it?" Vincent called late that night. "You're not going to believe this. They found a stash in the Golden Lily. Documents, thumb drives, photos. Looks like Melissa's been collecting dirt on all the key employees, including Harry. Especially on him. There's a whole folder full of evidence of financial fraud. She's been preparing a backup in case he tries to set her up." A surprise visitor showed up at the hospital, Harry's former partner from his first restaurant. "I should have known," he rubbed his tie nervously. 15 years ago, when he bought out my share, there were oddities with the paperwork there even then. Why didn't you say anything?" "I was afraid. I have a family, children, and Harry hinted that he knew people who might cause trouble." Investigator Donovan brought in new material, testimony from former Morning Star Consulting employees. They started talking. He unfolded the documents. Shell companies, fake contracts, money laundering. The scale is impressive. "What about the missing lawyer from Portland?" "Got a lead. He was seen at the Vancouver airport. Looks like he's trying to escape to Canada." Georgia went back to work. Complex surgeries helped take her mind off the maelstrom of events. In the operating room, it was simple and straightforward. Problem, solution, result. "How do you do it?" a young assistant asked. "Keep calm when there's so much chaos around." "Years of practice," she smiled through her mask. "And the realization that every action must be precise. One wrong cut and it could all go to waste." Eleanor called in the evening. They found the documents in Harry's safe, the ones about the first fraud. Turns out it all started before Melissa showed up. Not surprised, Georgia looked out at the night city through her office window. She just took advantage of something that already existed, like a tumor that finds a favorable environment to grow. The news showed a report from Portland. Reporters had found witnesses to Robert White's death. A maid who worked at the house recalled strange noises at night, Melissa's unusual behavior, mysterious visits from unknown people. "The circle is closing," Oliver remarked as he reviewed the report. "All the strings lead to the same center." Simon brought in new documents, evidence of Melissa's criminal connections. "She was smarter than we thought," the lawyer laid out the papers. "Created a whole network of shell companies, false identities, convoluted financial schemes. And left a trail of dead bodies everywhere," Georgia shook her head. "How come Harry didn't see who he was messing with?" "He saw," Simon pulled out another folder. "What's more, actively participated. Look, his signatures are on all the key documents." In the evening, a new scandal broke. Recordings of Melissa's conversations with a mysterious interlocutor were leaked online. They discussed details of eliminating unwanted witnesses, schemes to withdraw money, and plans to take over the business. "This is the end," Donovan commented. "We have all the evidence now." In the holding cell of the detention center, Melissa finally spoke. Her testimony confirmed the worst suspicions: a string of crimes stretching across several states, dozens of victims, millions of stolen dollars. "You know what the worst part is?" The investigator showed Georgia the interview transcripts. Not a shadow of remorse, like it was just a business strategy. Harry appeared at the hospital, gaunt, aged, with a wan look in his eyes. "I wanted to apologize." He stood in the doorway of her office. "Though I know it won't change anything." "Really?" Georgia didn't even turn toward him. "You know what the funny thing is? You didn't just ruin our marriage. You ruined your life's work. And for what?" I thought I could get more. But you got jail time and a reputation as an accomplice to a serial killer. Brilliant deal." The news continued to bring new details. In Seattle, they found documents linking Melissa to the disappearance of 3 other people. In Portland, they found witnesses to her secret meetings with criminal masterminds. "She's created a whole empire of lies," Oliver observed, "and almost succeeded." "Almost," Georgia smiled. "But she forgot one simple truth. Sooner or later, every lie comes out, like a cancerous tumor that can't be hidden forever." In the evening, she stood at the window of her office, watching the city sink into twilight. 15 years of life reduced to rubble. But from those ruins, something new was already beginning to sprout. "What now?" Simon asked, looking over the last of the case documents. "Now?" Georgia turned to him. "Now the hard part begins, the recovery. You know, in surgery after a tumor is removed, it's important to do more than just sew up the wound. You have to help the body get back to normal." Outside the window, a new day was beginning. The city was waking up, shaking off the remnants of a nightmare that had nearly destroyed one of the state's most successful companies. And somewhere in a detention center cell, Melissa Baker was preparing for the biggest defeat of her life. There were interrogations, trials, witness testimony ahead. But the main thing had already happened. The house of cards had collapsed, burying those who had built it under its rubble. The Washington State courtroom in Spokane was packed. Journalists, members of the public, witnesses, all were waiting for the start of the trial, which local newspapers had already dubbed the case of the century. The story of murder, financial fraud, and betrayal had attracted even national media attention. Georgia sat in the front row, next to Simon and investigator Donovan. Her presence here was necessary, not only as a witness for the prosecution, but as someone whose actions had helped uncover the entire chain of crimes. "The defendant will rise," Judge Richardson's voice boomed through the hushed hall. Melissa rose, impeccable business suit, perfect hair, cold stare. Even now, in the face of imminent judgment, she maintained a mask of impenetrability. The court will consider charges of first-degree murder, large-scale financial fraud, money laundering, and organizing a criminal enterprise. The judge flipped through the pages of the indictment. The first witness called was Dr. Hendricks. He had aged noticeably since their last meeting, his hands shaking as he took the oath of office. "Tell the court about the events in Portland," Prosecutor Sarah Martinez began her questioning. "Miss Baker, then Mrs. White, came to the clinic often." Hendricks's voice trailed off. "Asked about drugs, especially interested in those that were difficult to detect in a standard autopsy." There was absolute silence in the room. Georgia watched Melissa. Not a single muscle flinched on her face during her testimony. The next witness was a former maid from the White household. "I heard strange noises that night." The older woman rubbed her handkerchief nervously. "Mr. White was screaming, something was falling. And this morning, Mrs. White said he died of a heart attack." The prosecutor presented the results of a re-examination of Robert White's body, exhumed immediately after Melissa's arrest. Traces of a rare drug were found in the tissues, the expert pointed to the charts. Its effects mimic the symptoms of a heart attack, but with proper analysis, characteristic markers can be detected. Georgia shifted her gaze to Harry, sitting in the pew next to Melissa. He was gaunt and aged, seeming to shrink under the weight of the charges. After a break, the testimony of financial experts began. On the screens appeared schemes of money flow through shell companies, offshore accounts, fictitious contracts. The total amount of funds withdrawn exceeds $20 million, the expert pointed to the charts. The money went through a complex system of transactions, but ended up in accounts controlled by the defendant. Eleanor testified about financial fraud at the company. Her testimony, backed up by retained copies of documents, painted a picture of a massive fraud. "They started changing documents retroactively," she rasped out. "They created fictitious contracts, forged signatures, but I kept the originals of all the documents." Vincent described strange deals with vendors, pressure on employees, threats to those who tried to ask questions. "After I started inquiring about new contracts, I was attacked." He showed a scar above his eyebrow. "Got a hello from Miss Baker." Oliver presented the results of his investigation: photographs, recordings of conversations, documents gathered in bits and pieces over months of work. "We've discovered a link between Robert White's death and the disappearance of several key witnesses." He pointed to a diagram on the screen. "Each time, large sums of money were deposited into offshore accounts after an unwanted person was eliminated." The appearance of the Seattle investigator came as a surprise to everyone. He brought files on Melissa's first husband, a businessman who had died under mysterious circumstances. Same M.O., the investigator unfolded the photos. Same inheritance scheme, same suspicious transfers after his death. Melissa showed emotion for the first time. Her hand holding the glass of water shook faintly. The defense attorneys tried to build a line about insufficient evidence, about the age of some of the crimes, about possible irregularities in the collection of evidence. "Your Honor," the lead defense attorney waved his hands. "All of these charges are built on circumstantial evidence and testimony from interested parties." "Circumstantial?" Prosecutor Martinez raised an eyebrow. "Let me present the results of the DNA analysis found on the murder weapon of the Portland financier." Comparison charts appeared on the screen. The defense went pale. Harry suddenly asked for the floor. His confession sounded like a thunderclap. "I knew," his voice shook. "Knew about the shenanigans, the forging of documents, but I swear I didn't know about the murders. When I started to guess, it was too late. She threatened my family." Melissa turned sharply toward him. "Shut up." "No," he shook his head. That's enough. I'll tell you everything. About the first shenanigans, the forging of documents, the extortion. The judge called a recess. In the hallway, Georgia faced Melissa under a convoy of police officers. You think you won? Melissa's eyes were splashed with pure hatred. This isn't over. It is over. Georgia shook her head. You know what your biggest mistake was? You thought you could play endlessly with other people's lives, but every game ends sooner or later. The final witness was a former security guard from Portland. His testimony was the final nail in the defense's coffin. She paid to eliminate witnesses, he avoided looking into the audience, gave precise instructions on how it should look like an accident. The jury retired to deliberate. The courtroom clock counted down the minutes, adding up to hours. Georgia sat motionless, remembering all the stages of this long story. The jury is ready to reach a verdict, the judge announced. The hall froze. Melissa straightened, clutching the armrests of her chair. Guilty, the jury foreman read the verdict on each count of the indictment. Guilty, guilty. The sentence was harsh, life in prison without parole. Harry received 15 years for accessory to financial crimes. Justice has been served, Donovan commented after the hearing. Not quite, Georgia shook her head. There's no bringing back the dead, but at least she won't hurt anyone else. That evening, a complicated surgery awaited her at the hospital. A young patient with a brain tumor was a complicated case requiring complete concentration. How can you operate after a day like this? The assistant asked. You know, she put on her gloves. Sometimes you have to cut away all the unnecessary stuff to focus on what's important. In surgery, as in life, precision in every movement is important. Outside the operating room window, sunset was beginning to set. The city was living its life, unaware that today was the end of a story that might seem like fiction if it weren't true. The news was reporting the details of the verdict. Journalists were discussing the details of the case, theorizing about Melissa's other possible victims. What now? Simon asked, walking Georgia to her car. Now? She smiled. Now a new chapter begins. You know, after the tumor is removed, the body has to learn to live in a new way. It's a difficult process, but necessary. At night, she stood at the window of her office for a long time. 15 years of her life were behind her. Ahead was a new path, without lies, without betrayal, without dark secrets. On the table lay a necklace, the very necklace that had started this story. Georgia put it away carefully in its jewelry box. Some things were better left in the past to move on. A year after Melissa and Harry's sentencing, Spokane was preparing to open a new restaurant. The former Golden Lily was replaced by a modern establishment with an elegant interior and panoramic windows. Vincent Clark, who became its owner, personally supervised every detail of the preparations. A new beginning, he led Georgia through the renovated halls. You know, after everything that happened, I thought about getting out of the restaurant business. But then I realized you can't let other people's crimes ruin your dreams. Georgia looked around the room, noting how skillfully the architects had transformed the space. There was no trace of the previous interior. Light colors, airy designs, and live plants created an atmosphere of cleanliness and renewal. What happened to the rest of the chain restaurants? She paused at a large window overlooking the city. Some have been bought out by new owners, some have closed. Vincent pointed to a wall of photos. But the main thing is, we kept the team. Almost all the old employees found new jobs. The opening was attended by the city's elite, journalists, and longtime clients. Eleanor, elegant in a dark blue suit, was giving out interviews about the revitalization of the restaurant business in the city. You know, she took Georgia aside, after that scandal, a lot of people thought the industry in town wouldn't recover. But look, New owners, fresh ideas, honest businesses. Oliver showed up closer to evening, as always in his worn leather jacket with his invariable notepad in his pocket. Heard the news from Portland, he ordered coffee. Found another body, the paralegal who helped Melissa file the paperwork for White's inheritance. When did this happen? 6 years ago, recorded as an accident, a fall in the mountains. But now that they've started digging deeper, details of the investigation continued to emerge on the news. Journalists were unearthing more details of Melissa's crimes, finding connections to other unsolved cases. She's created an entire evil empire, Investigator Donovan remarked as he joined their table, and might have kept going if it weren't for your persistence. Georgia shook her head. I was just doing what I had to do, like a doctor who sees the symptoms of a terminal illness. At the hospital, life went on as usual. Complex surgeries, consultations, rounds. The work helped keep her inner balance. The young patient she operated on the day of the exposé made a full recovery and returned to normal life. You saved more than just me, he said at his last checkup. You saved my faith in justice. Simon peered into her office with new documents. The process of restoring the company's assets was nearing completion. Most of it has been recovered. He unfolded the papers. Of course, some of the losses are irreparable, but overall, the important thing is that justice was served. Georgia signed the papers, though the price was high. Martha stayed to work for her. The loyal housekeeper refused to leave even after all the events. You know, she said, arranging fresh flowers in vases, sometimes you have to go through dark times to see the light. In a city park, Georgia happened to meet Harry's mother, an elderly woman looking aged and gaunt. I don't know how to apologize. She took a seat on a bench nearby. For my son, for everything. You don't have to. Georgia shook her head. Everyone makes their own choices for themselves. The letter from Harry came through the lawyer. 10 pages of confessions, regrets, attempts to explain the inexplicable. I was blind, he wrote, chased the specter of success and lost my most precious possession. Georgia set the letter aside unread. Some wounds were better left in the past so they could heal. That evening, everyone who had helped solve the crimes, Oliver, Eleanor, Simon, Investigator Donovan, gathered at Vincent's new restaurant. Here's to new beginnings, Vincent raised his glass. And here's to people who aren't afraid to fight for the truth. Georgia looked out at the lights of the evening city through the panoramic windows. A year ago, the drama of betrayal and revenge had played out here. Now, a new story had begun, a story of rebirth. You know, Oliver sat down next to her. I've been working with all kinds of cases for years, but I've never seen anything like this, for one person to unravel such a tangle of crimes. I was just doing my job, she smiled, like a surgeon removing a tumor, methodical, precise, leaving no affected tissue. Late that night, she returned home. The office still held the folders of the investigation, evidence of a dark story that might seem like fiction if it weren't true. On the desk was a photograph of her in Harry's first restaurant, young, happy, full of hope. Georgia carefully tucked the picture away in a drawer. The past must be remembered, but the present must be lived. In the morning there was a complicated surgery coming up, a young patient with a rare brain pathology. Georgia prepared for it with her usual meticulousness, reviewing scans, planning each step. "How are you doing?" the young assistant asked as she prepared the operating room. "After everything that's happened." "You know," she put on her gloves, "in life, as in surgery, it's important to be able to separate the major from the minor. And remember, after any surgery, the healing process begins." Outside the window, dawn was breaking. The city was waking up, starting a new day. Somewhere in a prison cell, Melissa was serving her life sentence. Somewhere in another prison, Harry was trying to make sense of his mistakes. And here, in the operating room of Spokane City Hospital, Georgia was preparing to save another life. Because that was what it was all about. Not revenge, not punishment, but healing. "Scalpel," she commanded. A new day brought new challenges, new trials, new opportunities. Life went on, and that was her ultimate victory. Over lies, betrayal, darkness. In the evening she climbed again to the roof of the hospital, a place where she liked to think about difficult cases. The city spread out below, twinkling with lights, alive, renewed, cleansed of filth. Sometimes you have to lose everything, she thought, to find what's most important. Her cell phone vibrated in her robe pocket. A new patient, a new surgery, a new call. Georgia smiled. Life went on, and that was the ultimate proof that light always triumphs over darkness. And the necklace that started this story remained in her jewelry box, a reminder that sometimes the most valuable things have no material value. The real value is in the ability to remain human even in the darkest of circumstances. And that was the main wisdom Georgia drew from the story. There is no darkness that can extinguish the inner light. You just have to find the strength to keep shining.